Welcome to the Capital Forum interview series. My name is Karina Lubell, and today I'm speaking with Diana Moss, president of the American Antitrust Institute. Before joining the AAI, Diana was senior staff economist at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where she coordinated competition analysis for electricity mergers. Diana, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So our topic this morning is antitrust in the energy sector. And Diana, to start, maybe it would be helpful if you could give us an overview of the different agencies that play a role in reviewing energy mergers and their different mandates.
Sure. So energy and electricity in particular is a fairly complex area. Anything involving a regulated industry is generally going to involve multiple levels of review and jurisdictions. So what we have in the electricity space is a federal regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is responsible for really looking at interstate commerce. So anything in the wholesale markets would be under FERC's purview. And as you know, we've got a bunch of state-level regulators who regulate commerce within the state, so more at the retail level. So this wholesale-retail divide is a really interesting one in electricity. And FERC is responsible under the Federal Power Act for assessing competitive issues and questions, things like mergers under Section 203 of the Federal Power Act. And their standard is a public interest standard, which is a broader standard, which includes not only the effect on competition, but the effect on regulation, for example, the effect on ratepayers. So FERC has a broader public interest standard, much like any regulatory agency. At the same time, the antitrust agencies have the authority to look at competitive issues involving electricity, whether it's a merger under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, or whether it's a monopolization concern under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, or even concerns relating to agreements under Section 1. And the DOJ takes a lot of initiative and has had a number of enforcement actions involving electricity. So we have FERC on the regulatory side, and we have DOJ on the antitrust side. The FTC in the past has gotten involved in electricity mergers, mostly involving the combination of gas pipelines, for example, and electric utility companies. But this complementarity is really important because FERC's public interest standard is a bit different than the antitrust standard, which is simply no harm to competition. And there are things that FERC can do that the antitrust enforcers can't do in terms of protecting and promoting competition, and vice versa. And so it's very important for the two agencies, the two forms of oversight, to work together and to be complementary. And then, of course, whenever you have a merger that comes along, the states can get involved too. So we say there are many cooks in the kitchen.
Yep. Okay. Oh, that's really helpful. And actually, since you brought up the merger context, maybe you could give us some examples of how each agency would play a role in reviewing a merger, an energy or electricity merger.
Sure. So FERC as a regulator has sort of an open advocacy process. So any transfer of assets, of jurisdictional assets at FERC involving electric utilities would require the companies to make a filing. Okay. Mm-hmm. And those filings are on the public record. And like any regulator, FERC has a process where it solicits comments, interventions. Parties can come in and protest a merger, for example. But it's all on the open record, and it gives the ability for the public to do some analysis. And it promotes transparency. So FERC will initiate a proceeding and evaluate, among other things, the effect of the merger on competition. The antitrust agencies obviously become engaged when companies make a filing under the Hart-Scott-Rodino filing requirements. If the agencies are concerned about a competitive problem, then they will go out for a second request. They may investigate, and in some cases will actually challenge a merger. And that's where it gets interesting, because we have had many cases where FERC has not found a merger to be objectionable and has allowed a merger to proceed, where FERC, I'm sorry, where DOJ on the other hand has found competitive issues and has remedied the merger.
And so are FERC's investigation and the DOJ's investigation done in parallel, or how is it that they end up coming to different conclusions? Does that happen at different times?
The timing can be a little bit different. Typically, DOJ will wait for all the regulators to go. they'll they'll wait to see what happens in the regulatory arena, both at the federal level and at the state level. This is happening right now with the Exelon Pepco merger. FERC has gone and didn't find any problem with the merger. A number of states are involved: Maryland, D.C., New Jersey, others. And the DOJ is sort of waiting in the background to see what happens. Now, in the Exelon PSC&G merger, which was actually a merger that never happened, the FERC passed on that merger. They didn't find any competitive issues, but the DOJ did have competitive concerns because the merger consolidated generation, and there were concerns over the ability of the companies to withhold generation as a large generation supplier to drive up prices. So DOJ required divestitures in that case.
And so what happens when you end up with one agency coming to one conclusion and another? Does one give deference to the other, or how does that relationship work?
Well, it's interesting. In electricity, FERC and the DOJ don't actually formally coordinate. We don't. That's unusual. So in telecom mergers, for example, DOJ and the FCC have a memorandum of understanding, and they actually do coordinate. But in electricity, they don't coordinate. So the concern has appeared occasionally that, well, what happens if there is not a lot of coordination and FERC comes up with a remedy, for example, that conflicts somehow or is incompatible with a DOJ remedy? And that's never happened, actually. And it hasn't happened probably because FERC typically either takes a pass on the merger or they'll require some behavioral remedy. So some conditions that the company has to adhere to. We saw this, for example, in the Nova merger, which put together Southern California Gas, an intrastate gas pipeline, with San Diego Gas and Electric. They put into place several behavioral remedies that would prevent the company from favoring its own affiliates or foreclosing its rivals. DOJ, on the other hand, required a divestiture, which is a structural remedy. So we had FERC doing behavioral remedies and DOJ doing structural remedies. And they're not incompatible. There's a question, though, about whether both are necessary.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. And in a circumstance like that, is it the agency that has imposed with a behavioral remedy? Obviously, there's a certain level of monitoring that's required afterwards. Would it be whichever agency has imposed the behavioral remedy to monitor?
Yes, FERC has imposed, when they have used behavioral remedies, they have put together monitoring functions. Compliance is obviously very important. I mean, behavioral remedies have to be overseen for compliance, and so regulators are good at that. They're good at behavioral because that is the nature of regulatory oversight and compliance. DOJ uses monitors in many cases involving behavioral remedies. We haven't seen that in electricity, but we did see it in Comcast NBCU, for example, and Google ITA. We've seen other the antitrust agencies use monitors. So that does play that does factor in and play an important role as well. But we haven't seen any cases where there's been a direct conflict between not only the competitive issues that have been identified by the regulators versus the antitrust agencies or the remedies that have been used.
Okay, well, interesting. And so it sounds like there are some issues with the agencies working together in the merger context. Are there other competitive issues that are unique to the energy market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's been there's never a dull moment in electricity. I started in the business in the early 1990s when wholesale markets were just developing. And for the viewers who aren't as familiar with electricity markets, I think it's important to note that electricity is not a particularly sexy topic for anybody, including consumers who don't seem to think much about their service. They think about their bills for sure, but over the last 25 years, we've had a really robust development of wholesale markets in the United States, where the FERC has implemented a number of initiatives to open access to the transmission systems, to create organized markets, and to promote competition in those markets so that we do get entry and we get low prices and choice for consumers. Those wholesale markets run about 50% of electricity in the United States. So not many people know this. About 50% or more of electricity is traded through wholesale markets. In other parts of the country, the West, for example, where I'm from, the Rocky Mountain area in the Southwest, markets are not that organized, but there's bilateral trading that goes on. So FERC has worked very hard to promote competition in those markets. The DOJ has worked very hard using its authority to police anti-competitive activity and problematic mergers in those markets. So we have that whole layer going on, but increasingly, consumers are sort of in the spotlight. Obviously um, there are big initiatives to promote energy efficiency, and the question is where can we deliver that best? Do we deliver energy efficiency through the wholesale markets, or do we do it down at the consumer level? And that's what we see with some of these debates over rooftop solar and the ability of consumers to install what we call distributed generation at a very disaggregated level. And what we're finding are some concerns developing over utilities who are also competing in in that space in delivering energy efficiency, potentially attempting to squeeze out or foreclose rivals that are trying to sell and deliver energy services directly through the consumer. So there are a few lawsuits that have developed, and
I know these private
yes,
lawsuits?
there's a private suit right now involving rooftop solar, and there may be more potentially, but that's a very interesting question because it will definitely involve the antitrust agencies if the government decides to take an interest in these problems. This is not something that FERC can deal with, but certainly state commissions who are charged with overseeing retail rates and service. Certainly, state commissions might be involved in that particular issue. So we're watching that closely to see how that landscape develops.
And has the DOJ expressed any interest in investigating this area?
Not that I know of. I know that the DOJ keeps very careful track of the competitive issues that sort of emerge in different parts of the industry. The DOJ has the ability to look at competition issues anywhere, whether it's upstream in the input markets or in the wholesale markets or even down at the retail level. So they don't have any regulatory jurisdiction that they have to that they are constrained by.
Okay. But it sounds like if this becomes a big enough issue, if there are enough consumers who begin to speak up, then maybe we'll see some regulatory action here.
Very possibly. And one problem is that the way our utility models are set up in the country now is utilities have incentives to sell megawatts. They don't have incentives to not sell megawatts. And that is a bit incompatible with the goals of energy efficiency, which is to cut back on consumption. So it would be an improvement for utilities to be incentivized to sell energy services, right? Which could include megawatts or it could include energy efficiency. And but that's not the way our retail models are set up now.
Yeah.
And so that gives them incentives potentially to want to squeeze out their rivals because they would rather provide the services themselves. And so I think what we're seeing are competition issues sort of butting heads with the traditional utility model, which may have to change.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's something that'll be worth closely tracking.
Absolutely.
But
Yes.
unfortunately, I think that our time is about up. But thank you again, Diana, for speaking with us this morning. And hopefully we'll have a chance to do this again soon.
I hope so. Thank you.